In the final years of the Pacific War, Japan's admirals gathered inside dimly lit command bunkers, staring at charts that grew emptier by the week. Merchant convoys were vanishing. Destroyers sent to hunt the enemy never returned. The sea, once Japan's lifeline, had become a graveyard. What they could not admit publicly was clear in private memos and whispered conferences. American submarines were dismantling the empire from below, faster than any countermeasure could be invented. This is the story of the moment Japanese commanders realized they were fighting an enemy they could no longer stop. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the map seemed to tilt decisively in Japan's favor. From December 1941 through mid-1942, the empire's forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific with astonishing speed. Manila, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, each fell in rapid succession, giving Japan control of the very resources it had long coveted. Yet victory on land and sea masked a quiet vulnerability. Every barrel of oil from Borneo, every ton of ore from Malaya, every shipment of rice or coal depended on a merchant fleet stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. More than 90% of Japan's war material moved by sea, threading through narrow straits and open expanses where a single sinking could mean the loss of fuel, equipment, and the men who carried it. For Japan, these lifelines were not optional. They were the bloodstream of an empire now committed to a total war it believed it could sustain. Pre-war doctrine assumed that Japan's merchant fleet could operate with relative safety. Enemy submarines, Tokyo believed, were too slow, too loud, and too limited in torpedo firepower to challenge a convoy system protected by the Imperial Navy. In 1942, Japanese commanders still viewed submarine warfare primarily through the lens of their own doctrine, one centered on fleet actions, not commerce destruction. Merchant shipping, they believed, was secondary, and American submarines, they concluded, were simply not a serious threat. Across the Pacific, inside cramped steel hulls patrolling beneath the waves, the reality was far more complex. The U.S. submarine force made up barely 2% of the Navy's manpower, yet it carried a mission out of proportion to its size. These early war patrols were marked by frustration and near disaster. Torpedoes that struck targets failed to detonate. Others ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath enemy keels. Young crews, many barely out of training, struggled with hesitant tactics shaped by decades of pre-war caution. Time after time, promising attacks dissolved into technical failure. Yet beneath this rocky beginning was a weapon waiting to be unleashed. Engineers would soon expose the torpedo flaws that had crippled early operations. Commanders would abandon outdated doctrine, embracing aggressive, independent patrols that thrust submarines deep into Japan's shipping lanes. And slowly, methodically, the hunters would begin to sharpen their teeth. As 1943 dawned, Japanese admirals still believed the submarine threat was containable. They had no idea that within a year, their entire war economy would begin collapsing beneath the waves. By 1943, the slow, uneven beginnings of the American submarine campaign were giving way to something far more dangerous. A transformation driven by new leadership, sharpened tactics, and finally, weapons that worked as intended. At Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarine forces in the Pacific, pushed relentlessly for answers to the failures that had plagued early patrols. His insistence on testing the Mark 14 torpedo under real conditions, including firing them against the cliffs of Kaho'olawe, revealed what crews had long suspected. The torpedoes ran too deep, their magnetic exploders were unreliable, and their contact pistols often collapsed without triggering detonation. By mid-1943, the fixes were in place. For the first time, American submarines carried weapons worthy of their missions. A new generation of skippers now stepped forward, men who approached submarine warfare with a blend of boldness and tactical clarity. Commanders like Dudley Morton of the Wahoo and Eugene Fluckey of the Barb set the standard for aggressive, precision attacks. They used radar not merely as a detection tool, but as the backbone of nighttime surface strikes, closing within firing range under the cover of darkness, engines roaring above the waterline, their silhouettes barely distinguishable from the sea. Under these leaders, the submarine force no longer avoided risk. It sought it out, calculating every move to break apart the convoys that fed Japan's empire. By late 1943, the United States adopted wolfpack tactics, coordinated patrol groups of 3 submarines working as a single hunting unit. Guided by improved communications and radar, these packs positioned themselves along the expected routes of Japanese convoys. Once contact was made, the results could be catastrophic. One submarine would shadow the convoy from a distance, feeding constant updates. Another would maneuver ahead, cutting across the convoy's path. The third would swing wide, ready to strike the stragglers or exploit any confusion. On many nights across the Philippine Sea and the waters east of Formosa, those attacks unfolded with brutal efficiency. Radar picked up convoys long before Japanese lookouts glimpsed a silhouette. Torpedo salvos raced across black waves, slamming into freighters laden with fuel, ore, or ammunition. Flames rose hundreds of feet, illuminating the chaos as more submarines joined the assault. Entire convoys were destroyed in a single night, ships burning, breaking, or slipping beneath the surface before escorts could mount any organized defense. Japan's response was fractured. Escort ships were too few, sonar equipment too weak, and depth charge patterns decades behind evolving American tactics. Many escort crews lacked proper anti-submarine training, a consequence of Japan's strategic focus on surface fleet battles rather than commerce defense. Internal naval memos from 1944 warned that maritime losses were unsustainable, a stark admission that the empire's logistical foundation was beginning to collapse. With every ship lost, Japan's fuel reserves shrank, but the real dread came from the spreading belief that the enemy was everywhere and nowhere all at once. By 1944, the outward shape of the Pacific War had changed beyond recognition. What had once been a struggle for territory was now a battle for survival, and nowhere was this more visible than in Japan's rapidly collapsing merchant fleet. In a single year, the empire lost more than 3 million tons of shipping, a rate of destruction no wartime economy could withstand. Convoys that once moved confidently across the South China Sea now crept along the edges of coastlines, hoping distance alone might shield them. But by 1944, distance meant little. American submarines were everywhere. Japan's naval staff launched frantic defensive measures. Convoys were rerouted into longer, less efficient paths. Ships were ordered to move at night, hugging shadowed waters to avoid radar detection. Destroyers were reassigned from fleet duties to escort missions, and new escort vessels, the Kaibaken classes, were rushed into production. Training schools attempted to expand anti-submarine instruction, but time was too short, and fuel shortages meant many crews never practiced with real equipment. These efforts created the illusion of a coordinated defense, but reality told a harsher story. By the time most convoys reached the open sea, the submarines were already waiting. The technological gap widened with every month. American submarines carried surface search radar that could track convoys far beyond visual range. Their torpedoes, now reliable, included electric models like the Mark 18, which left no visible wake. Sonar evasion tactics had become an art. Skippers used thermal layers, silent running, and sudden depth shifts to slip away from counterattacks. Japan, meanwhile, relied on detection gear that lagged years behind, equipment unable to match the speed, accuracy, or sensitivity of its American counterparts. Escort ships often launched depth charges on guesswork, hoping sheer quantity would succeed where technology could not. Inside Tokyo's Naval General Staff, panic surfaced in official reports. One memo described submarines as the most serious threat to the empire's survival, a stark reversal from early war confidence. But even alarm could not fix the core problem. Japan's fuel reserves were draining faster than they could be replaced. Destroyers tasked with defending convoys had to conserve precious fuel. Many sailed at reduced speed, making them easier targets. Others lacked the endurance to escort convoys over long distances, leaving merchant ships exposed where submarine attacks were most likely. There were stark moments of disbelief. After one 1944 patrol, reports showed a single American submarine crippling an entire convoy, including oil tankers Japan could not hope to replace. The arithmetic of the war had turned fatal. Too few ships, too little fuel, too many losses. Commanders began to understand that they were trapped in a struggle they could not win with courage or tradition. They were losing a war of logistics and mathematics. As Japan burned through its final liters of aviation fuel, a darker truth settled in. The submarines were not just sinking ships. They were erasing Japan's ability to wage war at all. By the beginning of 1945, Japan's maritime world had collapsed into ruin. What had once been one of the largest merchant fleets in Asia, more than 6 million tons of shipping, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Fewer than 1 million tons remained afloat, and even that figure masked a harsher truth. Many of the surviving vessels were damaged, under repair, or lacked the fuel to sail. The arteries that once fed the empire's war machine had been severed. Every surviving route, every desperate convoy that still attempted the passage from Singapore, Formosa, or the Dutch East Indies, moved knowing the ocean had turned hostile. Across the home islands, the effects were unmistakable. Aircraft that should have been defending Japan's skies sat immobile on runways, empty of aviation fuel. Armored brigades nominally assigned to repel invasion found their tanks useless, engines silent for want of refined petroleum. Garrison troops in Manchuria, the Philippines, and the islands of the Central Pacific endured sharp rations as food shipments dwindled. Factories that once produced aircraft parts and ammunition fell quiet, their machines starved of oil and raw materials. The paralysis wasn't confined to the front lines. It spread through every layer of the war effort. American submarines, emboldened by success, extended their campaign beyond merchant shipping. They began striking directly at warships, cruisers, destroyers, and even capital vessels thought too well protected for underwater attack. In November 1944, the submarine Archerfish torpedoed and sank Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. Japan had poured immense resources into this vessel, intending it as a bulwark for future defense. Instead, it survived only 10 days after commissioning. Losses like this carried symbolic weight, signaling that even Japan's most powerful warships could not move safely through its own waters. Within the Naval General Staff, despair crept into official communication. Reports acknowledged that Japan had no effective means to stop American submarines, a grim admission from a navy long defined by its doctrine of decisive battle. Destroyer captains, charged with escorting what little shipping remained, often hesitated to undertake offensive sweeps. Returning to port might mean burning fuel that could never be replaced. For many, every operation felt like a one-way mission, an irreversible expenditure of strength for little hope of success. Among officers at sea, a quieter resignation took hold. They spoke of fighting ghosts, enemies unseen until torpedo tracks carved through the water, or explosions tore open the hull of a ship they were sworn to protect. There was no rhythm to these attacks, no surface fleet to defeat, no battle line to challenge. Only an invisible, relentless enemy striking from the depths. In the final months, Japanese admirals no longer asked how to stop American submarines. They asked only how long the nation could endure without the lifeline the sea once provided. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a country running on fumes, not metaphorically, but literally. Its factories, once able to churn out aircraft, artillery, and ammunition around the clock, fell silent as the supply of iron ore, bauxite, and petroleum evaporated. The destruction of industry did not come primarily from the firebombing of Tokyo or Osaka, but from an absence of the raw materials that once arrived in steady streams from Southeast Asia. Submarines had severed those arteries months before the first B-29s appeared overhead. Industrial output collapsed by more than half, and in some sectors, especially aviation fuel and shipbuilding, production all but ceased. Workers reported to factories that had no power, no steel, and no shipments on the horizon. Machine tools stood idle under layers of dust, silent reminders of an economy slowly suffocating. The empire that had once stretched across the Pacific could no longer sustain even the basics of war. Hunger crept across the home islands with equal relentlessness. Grain shipments from Korea, China, and Southeast Asia dwindled as convoy after convoy vanished into the depths. Railway depots waited for deliveries that never arrived. Families rationed what little they had. A few ounces of rice, thin soup, vegetables grown in bomb-scarred soil. In rural regions and crowded cities alike, whispers of famine circulated, and by mid-1945 those whispers became recorded fact. Japan was starving. Within the Naval High Command, the final analyses were as stark as they were devastating. In post-war testimony, senior officers spoke plainly. American submarines, they said, had strangled Japan to death. It was not rhetoric, it was mathematics. The empire had lost its ability to move oil, food, and ore. The nation had been defeated long before its cities burned. The last convoys sent out in early 1945 bore the weight of this desperation. Many sailed with only token escorts, hoping speed or darkness might grant survival. Few made it. Most simply disappeared, torpedoed, shelled, or lost without any survivors to report their fate. Every sinking narrowed the future until no path remained. For Japan's leaders, surrender became inevitable not solely because of the devastation at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but because the nation had already been paralyzed. The American submarine force, just 2% of the U.S. Navy, had quietly delivered the most decisive blow of the Pacific War. In the ruins of the Naval Ministry, officers reviewed lost charts that needed no interpretation. The war had been decided not just in the skies over Tokyo or on the beaches of the Pacific, but in the silent depths below. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, few numbers speak as loudly, or as quietly, as those attached to the undersea campaign. By 1945, American submarines had sunk more than half of all Japanese ships lost in the conflict. 55% of Japan's wartime maritime destruction came not from carrier air groups or surface fleets, but from a force of barely a few hundred steel vessels, crewed by just over 50,000 men. Their impact was measured not in headlines or sweeping naval battles, but in the slow, relentless suffocation of an island empire built on the movement of cargo. The scale of this achievement becomes sharper when measured against the nation it helped dismantle. Japan's population neared 70 million, dependent on imported oil, rubber, steel, and food to sustain its industry and military operations. American submarine patrols, small teams navigating thousands of miles alone, often submerged for days, severed these lifelines with clinical precision. Again and again, tankers, troop transports, and merchant convoys vanished beneath the waves. By late 1944, the collapse was nearly complete. Shipyards could not replace losses, factories starved for raw materials, and entire armies overseas were left stranded without fuel or supplies. But the efficiency of the campaign carried a cost that echoed long after the war ended. Submariners suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any American branch. 52 U.S. submarines were lost, many without leaving a trace. For the families waiting at home, service beneath the ocean meant the constant fear that no wreckage would ever be found, no explanation ever given. On the other side of the conflict, Japanese merchant sailors endured some of the most catastrophic survival odds of the entire war. Many died not only in sinkings, but in the long, desperate hours spent in open water before the ocean claimed them. In the decades that followed, Japanese naval scholars reached a sobering consensus. The submarine blockade had been as decisive as any bombing campaign or battlefield defeat. It was the quiet pressure, the unseen approach, the sudden disappearance of vital cargo ships that truly crippled the nation's ability to fight. And so the greatest paradox remains. The quietest arm of the U.S. Navy delivered one of the war's most resounding blows. Today the Pacific is calm, its surface unbroken. Yet beneath that stillness lingers the memory of a conflict waged in silence, a silent war whose echoes shape the fate of nations.